I see. So as consultant thoracic surgeon at Bellsides Hospital, Sir Austin, you came to the conclusion, after years' experience of him, that Mr. Saul was a man motivated almost entirely by personal ambition.
That is correct, sir.
Was there any one thing that led you to this conclusion?
Well, it is a matter of more general observation. Mr. Saul was arrogant, self-opinionated. You couldn't miss that in him. He couldn't dominate the situation. Mr. Saul was just not interested.
There were disputes between you then?
Constant disputes.
Now, could you tell us about some of these?
Well, we can come to the Eric Maple and the heart transplant directly, can we?
If you so wish.
Yes, well, Eric Maple was admitted into the intensive care unit at Bellsides on the 29th of April last. Cardiogram showed us clearly that he was suffering from a diseased mitral valve.
Again, these are technical terms, and I think it is important that they should be explained to the jury, Sir Austin.
I beg your pardon, my lord. What we call a cardiogram is an X-ray picture of the chambers of the heart, achieved by injecting a radio-opaque liquid directly into them, which shows up as a shadow on the X-ray plate.
I see. And the mitral valve?
The mitral valve is a narrow orifice in the heart through which the blood is pumped into the left ventricle, thence to be fed into the aorta and the rest of the body. Malfunction of this valve can cause circulatory insufficiency, greater or lesser, depending on the extent of the damage.
I see. Thank you.
Now, in Eric Maple's case, how extensive was this damage to the mitral valve, Sir Austin?
Extensive enough. I was obliged to tell the wife, after our diagnosis, that her husband was, in all probability, never be on the fit list again.
Would you have called Eric Maple a hopeless case then, Sir Austin?
No. No, there was nothing hopeless about Eric Maple. Hopeless is a word you don't use until you're writing out the death certificate anyway. No, given care and a reasonable regimen, there was no reason why he shouldn't have lived for years. I have every confidence that he would have done if he'd been given half a chance.
And what treatment did you prescribe for Eric Maple, Sir Austin?
Medication at that stage. The heart was sluggish, needed the help of drugs. Later, I thought there might be a case for installing a pacemaker. That's a powered device, my lord, that keeps the heart beating at the right rate.
Did Mr. Saul agree with this treatment, Sir Austin?
No, Mr. Saul did not. Mr. Saul wanted to perform an operation for the replacement of the diseased mitral valve.
Now, is this medically possible?
Oh, yes, it's a common procedure. Replacement valves are made of stainless steel nowadays. But that does not necessarily mean that it should be advised in every case. One has to make up one's mind to proceed or not on all the evidence, not on just that part of it which happens to appeal to one.
You didn't yourself believe, then, that surgery should be attempted in the case of Eric Maple?
No, I did not. Every other method of treatment must be found useless before you reach for the knife. Besides, Eric Maple was in a generally debilitated condition. It was my seriously considered opinion that surgery at this stage might be the means of shortening his life rather than prolonging it.
Now, did you say all this to Mr. Saul, Sir Austin?
I did.
And did he have some comment in reply?
Well, I think he called me a prevaricating old oojar.
Urger, isn't it?
Yes, my lord. Some very curious antipodean expression, I recall. He also said that if I wouldn't give him permission to perform an operation on the diseased mitral valve, we might in time have to think of a heart transplant.
Now, what did he mean by that, Sir Austin?
I don't know. But since he had raised the subject of a heart transplant, I told him there and then that as long as I was head of the unit, no such surgery would be performed on Eric Maple, nor indeed on any other patient if it could be avoided.
Why is that, Sir Austin? Can you tell us?
I'm sorry?
Well, are you in the general way opposed to heart transplant surgery?
Oh, well, the margin of success in these operations is extremely small. It can only be considered as a last-ditch measure in surgery, a gamble. There's nothing else left that you can do.
Sir Austin, would you say that this represents a general consensus of opinion of the medical profession on heart transplants?
I think more and more surgeons are coming to realize that the problems of rejection are immense, my lord.
Does this knowledge come to you from personal experience of heart transplants?
Oh, yes, my lord. I have considerable personal experience of the technique. Now, the research people nowadays are coming to think more of an efficient artificial pump to replace the diseased heart. If you won't misunderstand me, heart transplant is a very theatrical operation. Royal Shakespeare surgery, to coin a phrase.
In any event, you informed Mr. Saul that you wouldn't consider a heart transplant, where Eric Maple was concerned, Sir Austin.
I did. I made that as clear to him as I could.
And was there yet more trouble as a result?
Things were decidedly uncivilized for a time. I told him that he'd come to look upon the patients in intensive care as experimental units.
Did you put that in a slightly different way, perhaps?
I imagine I used the word guinea pigs.
Now, on May the 7th, while you were not at the hospital, Sir Austin, Eric Maple had a massive coronary thrombosis.
Yes, that is so.
Were you notified of this, Sir Austin?
I regret to say that I was not.
Would you have expected to be notified?
Most certainly. A coronary thrombosis of a man in Maple's condition was a very serious affair. It was a hospital rule that under such circumstances I should have been informed.
It's been testified that at about 8:30 p.m. when he alerted the transplant team, Mr. Saul gave it out that you were away in the country and couldn't be reached. Now, was there in fact any truth in that, Sir Austin?
On the night of May the 7th, I was at home and did not go out, as a telephone call at any time could have verified. First I heard of the affair was when the hospital secretary rang me up, in the early hours of May the 8th, to tell me what had occurred and ask me what might be going on in my own department. Well, I went to the hospital immediately, but by then there was very little that could be done. I tried to see that all the immunosuppressive measures were taken to help the heart transplant, but by then rejection symptoms were well advanced, and in less than quite a few hours the patient was dead.
Now, from a strictly professional point of view, do you say that Mr. Saul failed in his duty as a doctor by performing this operation?
Mr. Saul did not seek the consent of the next of kin to this operation. That in itself was a breach of duty of one sort. But into the bargain, he displayed, in my opinion, an unbelievable disregard for the life of a patient under his care. There are other measures that Mr. Saul might have taken. He chose the high-risk, statistically indefensible heart transplant operation for personal reasons, not for medical ones.
In other words, it may truly be said that Mr. Saul's medical attentions accelerated the death of his patient.
Indeed it may. Eric Maple is dead when he might very well have been alive.
Sir Austin, on the night of May the 7th, we've been told Eric Maple had a massive coronary thrombosis.
Yes.
Now, what is a massive coronary thrombosis and what are its consequences?
Coronary thrombosis occurs when one of the vessels supplying the heart becomes obstructed by a blood clot. Massive is merely an adjective used to indicate that the interference with the circulatory system is severe.
And what's the worst single effect of a coronary thrombosis?
Death.
Yes, indeed, but those that don't die, are they sometimes left with damage of a certain sort?
Scarring of the heart can occur, yes. What this means is that the cardiac muscle itself becomes badly strained, causing a weakening of the heart as an effectively functioning organ.
Had scarring of the heart occurred with Eric Maple, do you happen to know?
No, it's debatable. Perhaps, to some extent.
Well, why do you say it's debatable?
Well, I was unable to examine the heart myself until after the event, when it had already been removed from the body and some decomposition had set in. Well, it's impossible to tell with any certainty at that stage. Well, pathologists had the same trouble you had as a report here, haven't you?
Oh, yes, indeed. But wouldn't the surgeon on the spot be in a better position to make a judgment concerning this heart scarring?
The main problem in these cases...
Surely, Sir Austin, once Mr. Saul had the patient on the heart-lung machine, he would be able to inspect the heart and make a proper judgment.
Oh, yes, yes. He should have been able to.
Yes, so here we have a patient saddled not only with a diseased mitral valve, but with a heart so severely weakened that it had ceased to perform its natural function. So Mr. Saul decided the only course was to perform a heart transplant.
Mr. Saul found that by chance a heart had suddenly become available in casualty. He didn't stop to think any further. The only possible explanation is that he wanted the publicity and esteem that a heart transplant operation might be expected to bring him.
I see. Now, Sir Austin, these other measures Mr. Saul might have taken rather than perform the transplant, what are they?
What?
We shall need to know in some detail, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, quite obviously he should have performed a bypass operation. That's the only thing to have done.
Now, what is that?
A bypass operation is quite the commonest technique that a surgeon can deploy for the relief of coronary thrombosis. The obstructed vessel is circumvented by, well, what really amounts to a rather sophisticated bit of plumbing. A section of vein is taken from another part of the body and sewn into the coronary artery above the obstruction. The other end is fastened below it, thus providing a bypass for the blood. It requires very delicate surgery, of course, but in the right hands, the results can be very satisfying.
Well, if he believed it to be the best chance for his patient, is there any reason why a surgeon would not have performed this bypass operation?
Because it was beyond his skill, perhaps.
Beyond his skill?
Possibly.
Sir Austin, you're telling the court that this complete heart transplant is technically simpler than the bypass operation you described earlier.
Yes, my lord, I am.
Because you seem to be implying that because he found this bypass operation beyond his skill, the accused didn't even consider it for his patient.
I can think of no other possible explanation of events, my lord. The bypass operation should have been done. It's impossible to avoid the conclusion that by his ill-timed surgical attention, Mr. Saul shortened the life of his patient.
Sir Austin, did Eric Maple at any time express to you an opposition to the idea of a heart transplant?
The matter was never discussed between us, but I understand that his wife was very much...
Eric Maple said nothing to you, Sir Austin.
No, but as I say, his wife
Thank
was...
you. Now, how quickly did your opinion of Mr. Saul as a medical man deteriorate?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what you mean.
Something over a year ago, you took him on as your assistant, believing he had the correct qualifications. Now you believe the opposite. When did this happen? Suddenly, at a certain point, or gradually?
Oh, gradually, yes.
Yet you still kept him on as your assistant.
Well, you can't just sack a man simply because an atmosphere of hostility has arisen. A surgical unit isn't run like the Kremlin, you know. A consultant has to strive to be primus inter pares, not God Almighty.
Yet you've implied Mr. Saul was incompetent. A fundamental technique like the bypass operation was beyond his skill. Now, were you not consequently endangering the lives of your patients by permitting him to continue in the unit?
Well, things were usually done under my aegis. And besides, I did finally refuse him permission to operate on any heart cases.
And yet immediately afterwards you left him to be roster surgeon over the weekend. The only surgeon on duty when the crisis occurred. Now, come, Sir Austin, you can't have it both ways. Either you believe in Mr. Saul as a competent medical man, or you were behaving utterly irresponsibly and failing to dismiss him from the hospital.
Now, look here. I'm not on
Did
trial
you
here.
dislike Mr. Saul on sight, Sir Austin? Tell me, what was the worst offence Mr. Saul did on May the 7th? He performed a heart transplant? Or that he performed it without first consulting you?
My lord, must I answer these questions?
Yes, Sir Austin, I'm afraid you must. Your personal attitude to Mr. Saul is plainly relevant.
Did you always dislike Mr. Saul?
He was not a particularly easy man to like. Brash, conceited, a certain curious disrespect about him.
Well, you must certainly have believed in his ability then, Sir Austin, for you to have endured all that.
I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I was wrong. But there is often surgical talent beneath a rough exterior, even in these colonials, as I believe we're no longer allowed to call them.
Thank you, Sir Austin. No further questions.
You may leave the witness box, Sir Austin.
Thank you, my lord.
That completes the case for the prosecution, my lord.
For my first witness, I call the defendant, Stephen Saul.
What is your religion?
In the Church of England.
Take the book in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.